Welcome to the War Watch podcast, a 6-episode series from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the War Watch podcast. Over 6 episodes, we examine conflicts that demand your attention, bringing you expert documentation, legal analysis, and concrete action you can take. War Watch is the Geneva Academy's new interactive online portal where you can explore conflicts and track international humanitarian law violations in those conflicts. Today, for episode 4, we focus on Haiti. Haiti doesn't often make international headlines. When it does, it's usually framed as gang violence spiraling out of control, another crisis in a country that's seen too many. But in 2024, something fundamental changed. Over 5,500 people were killed in gang-related violence that year alone. 1.4 million people displaced, which is 1 in 10 Haitians. 1 in 4 Haitians now lives in a gang-controlled neighborhood. State governance has essentially collapsed in much of the capital. And yet the situation is still very commonly regarded and referred to as gang violence, a domestic security problem, criminal violence requiring a police response. Until recently, the International Crisis Group released a major report called Undoing Haiti's Deadly Gang Alliance, documenting how gangs transformed from fragmented criminals into a unified force controlling most of Port-au-Prince. And that same week, we at the Geneva Academy formally classified Haiti as a non-international armed conflict, which is the first institution in the world to do so. In February 2024, Haiti crossed the threshold from gang violence to armed conflict. So today's question is, what changed? Why does it matter legally, and what comes next? I'm Juliette Graf, and joining me today are 2 very special guests. Diego Da Rin is a Haiti specialist with International Crisis Group. And as always, Stuart Casey-Maslen is joining me as our legal advisor here at the Academy and the head of the Aichon Focus project. Diego, let's start with you. For listeners who don't follow Haiti closely, could you walk us through how we got to February 2024?
Well, the consolidation of these broad gang alliances that presented to the world in early 2024 had been in the workings for some years. And the gang phenomenon is not something new in Haiti. Illegal armed groups have existed and have been used by the elites for decades. The history of the gangs that we see in Haiti today traces back at least to the 90s, when small armed organizations started emerging in poor neighborhoods of Port-au-Prince and were being used by some political groups and over time by economic elites as well. These illegal armed groups started being more powerful, expanding their sources of income, their arsenals, their armies, and the leverage that they had in their negotiations with their former sponsors that over time became their partners from the elites. And something that changed things in how the gangs operated between them and in their relations with the elites was the emergence of gang alliances in 2020. There was a group of gangs that created what is commonly known as the G9. The full name of this coalition was Revolutionary Forces G9 Family and Allies, and gangs were starting to present themselves as political actors. And in response to those who didn't want to join the G9, a rival gang coalition was created that is called the GPEP, that in Haitian Creole is the eyes of the people. It was that when the plans to have a foreign force on the ground started materializing, the gangs started engaging in dialogues between them, and they decided to join forces and create a united front to fight together against the state, to derail the plans to have a foreign force that could be stronger than them on the ground, and to force the state into negotiations while they still had the upper hand.
Could you please tell us a bit more about the specific merger on February 29, 2024, when the Prime Minister was in Kenya and Viv Ansanm coordinated all these attacks that made international headlines?
The wave of attacks that were being planned for some time started on the very day that then Prime Minister Henry landed in Nairobi to oversee the signature of an agreement that would allow the deployment of Kenyan officers in Haiti. In the early hours of that 29 February, the gang started attacking police stations, seaports, the airport, and what they essentially tried to do was to paralyze completely the capital. And they achieved that. For about 2 months and a half, they also attacked the prisons, allowing around half of Haiti's prison population to get freed. Many of these people started going and working with the gangs. And what they were trying to do was to prevent the prime minister from returning to the country. So, in effect, to topple Henry's government, because then the US, seeing that the prime minister was not able to return to the country, asked him to step down, and this created the necessity to form a new transitional government. The gangs joined in this new criminal alliance. Were planning to do was to bring the capital to a standstill, to halt any commercial activities, and to create the necessity to have a new government that they hoped will be willing to engage with them in negotiations.
Yeah, and the statistic we often hear is that the gangs control 85% of Port-au-Prince. What does that actually look like on the ground, both in terms of how they're organized and what it means for the people living there?
Well, it is difficult to summarize with a single figure the kind of control that the gangs have in the capital and beyond. Because what you have is gang strongholds that are very well protected. The gangs have dug ditches, they have erected walls with brick and concrete, they have snipers, they have dense networks of informants that are operating in the surrounding areas of their strongholds, which makes it very difficult for the security forces to penetrate in these very protected strongholds. Then, beyond these strongholds, there are these very contested areas, which are essentially no man's land. These are the combat zones. But gangs have been the de facto authorities in these strongholds for years. They are the ones that are able to greenlight the access to humanitarian aid, to water, to essential services. They have a very strict control of who is going out or in their areas, because gangs need for the population to remain in their strongholds so that they can use civilians as human shields in confrontations with the security forces.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing now sounds like pretty extraordinary organization and territorial control and even strategic operations that are carried out by Viv Ansanm. But these are still criminals. They kidnap, they're extortionists, they're murderers. How do we square that with what you're describing, which sounds almost political?
In Haiti and with these gangs, there is a very porous boundaries between criminal activities and political activities, and these groups have been deeply embedded in the political system since their inception. However, this role that they have played has shifted over time, because before they were working as the private armies for political and economic groups, whereas today they still have close ties with people from the elites, but they don't have masters who are dictating what they have to do. Now they have been developing a political discourse, because the bargain that they had before with politicians mostly is not as beneficial, and they are not as willing as they were before to only work for these elites that use them, for example, during the elections. So now the gangs that are fighting together against the state portray their battle as motivated by social injustice. They present themselves as armed people in the poor neighborhoods that have been used by corrupt oligarchs to win the elections and to expand their economic activities. And what they say is, we are the defenders of the poor who are fighting against the very few people that have all the economic and political power in their hands.
So, as already mentioned, the Geneva Academy just classified Haiti as a non international conflict. Stuart, what made yourself and the War Watch team look at Haiti differently after February 2024?
So we're always on the lookout for potential armed conflicts, looking at situations of armed violence where there are groups, whatever they be called, terrorists, gangs, cartels, whatever that may be. What we saw in Haiti was not just the explosion of violence. That was well known. That was not new. It was the existence of this coalition, this organized coalition that fulfilled the criterion that is required by international humanitarian law for a non-international armed conflict. You need both at the same time intense and regular armed violence and organization of the non-state armed group. And that coalition, even though it is in some ways quite informal and a little bit flexible, clearly meets the criteria. You do not require control of territory for there to be a non-international armed conflict. But if you do have control of territory as an armed group, it's a very good indication that you have that organization. So we decided, based on the evidence that we saw on the ground, that this now fulfilled the two criteria, and it was a non-international armed conflict.
But Stuart, does the label really matter? There's thousands dead, the gangs are controlling most of the capital. Whether we say gang violence or armed conflict, I think what some of us are wondering is, does it actually change anything?
I think it changes two important issues. One, I would say positive, the other perhaps a little bit more concerning. Once you have an armed conflict, then serious violations of international humanitarian law become punishable as war crimes. Indeed, there is a duty to punish war crimes. What that means is there is a possibility for accountability. If, for example, one of the members of Viv Ansanm who had engaged in war crimes or had supported or planned war crimes were to go to another country, they could potentially be prosecuted under the law in that country for acts they'd committed in Haiti. So that's an important measure of accountability. Where I think there is perhaps some concern is that when you are in an armed conflict, the use of force is more permissive. What that means is drone strikes, which are very, very rarely lawful in a situation outside armed conflict, may become lawful inside a situation of armed conflict, depending, of course, who is being targeted and whether due precautions are taken to protect civilians.
Thanks, Stuart. And maybe a way to really illustrate this to our listeners is through an example. So let me share one that we documented in our War Watch report. Early December 2024, in the War Jérémy neighborhood, a gang leader believed that voodoo practitioners had cursed his child, so he ordered a massacre. Between 184 and 207 people were killed in one night. The youngest victim was just 3 months old. Bodies were mutilated and burned. Stuart, can you walk us through the difference? How would a case like this be dealt with under gang violence versus how it should be dealt with now that Haiti is classified as an armed conflict?
So where there is a party to an armed conflict, and in this case it's the War Jérémy gang, which is a member of Viv Ansanm, when they engage in acts that are connected to that conflict and they engage in violations of IHL, then it will very often become a war crime. And certainly what happened on that night were multiple war crimes. Contrast that with a situation a couple of months earlier where there was the Graf gang that engaged in a massacre in Port Sunday. That would still be ordinary murder under national law, but it would not also be a war crime punishable abroad, punishable under international criminal law.
So we've talked about how this happened, the transformation. We've also talked about what it means legally with the classification. Now, let's talk about what's actually happening on the ground. Between June 2024 and December 2025, our War Watch report documented extensive violations of international humanitarian law. And I want to walk you through some of what we found because the pattern is really striking. Start with civilian infrastructure. Schools and universities were systematically targeted. The National School of Arts was burned. The National Library was destroyed. Multiple faculties at the State University of Haiti, science, linguistics, medicine, and pharmacy were all also burned. Hospitals have been attacked repeatedly. Bernard Mev's hospital was attacked on December 17th, 2024. Then on Christmas Eve, during the General Hospital's reopening ceremony, gangs attacked and killed 3 journalists and a police officer. Today, only 1/3 of Port-au-Prince health facilities are still functioning. In March 2025 alone, 3 major media outlets were destroyed in 4 days. Radio Caraïbe, which is Haiti's oldest broadcaster, Radio Mélodie FM, and Télé Pluriel, all burned or ransacked. Then there were the mass killings, including the one that we just mentioned in Wavre Jérémie between December 6 and 7, where at least 207 people were executed. I know I'm repeating myself, but I will because it's so horrifying. The youngest victim was just 3 months old. Sexual violence is also being used as a weapon of war. The UN calls it deliberate, systematic, and pervasive. UNICEF described it as turning children's bodies into battlegrounds. According to Human Rights Watch, some health facilities reported receiving up to 40 rape victims a day during peak periods. And then there's the children. Up to 50% of gang members are children, some who are as young as 8 years old. There are also 1 million children who are living in gang controlled areas right now. According to the UN Secretary General, 2,269 grave violations against children were verified in 2024, which is among the highest globally and is a 490% increase from the previous year. And then, since March 2025, there is another concern, which are the drone strikes, which the Haitian government has been using to target gang strongholds. Diego, you've been tracking these drone operations. Can you tell us a bit more about them?
High-ranking officials told us at that time that when they started using these explosive drones to counter the gang's offensive, this was seen by the authorities as a last resort to try to fend off the attacks by the gangs that were very rapidly advancing towards the roads that would enable them to gain access to the offices of Haiti's leadership. These explosive drones are operated by foreign contractors from a private military company that has been assisting a special security task force that the Prime Minister created a year ago, in late February of last year. Since then, the security task force has been assisting local officers in trying to mount very targeted operations against the gangs. And the use of these explosive drones has started to shift the balance of power on the ground because the gangs haven't been able, at least for now, to provide themselves with these kinds of explosive drones to retaliate against the security forces. So they have been able not only to more effectively counter the gang offensives when they are happening, but also to instill fear in the gang ranks because at any moment during the day or at night, an explosive drone could be used to strike areas that before were beyond reach of the Haitian security forces. And also, of course, there is a whole debate about the use of these explosive drones in Haiti because foreign legal experts say that it is illegal as Haiti has not been officially recognized as being in an armed conflict. So the Haitian authorities have very cold feet to acknowledge the use of these explosive drones. But on the other hand, Haitians think that anything should be used to try to counter these gangs that have been growing exponentially and very rapidly expanding their foothold with scorched earth tactics, both in the capital, but also expanding to other regions where gangs didn't have any presence before. But in their efforts to show concrete results with these explosive drones, the foreign contractors have also harmed civilian population. There was a very striking incident in September when there was a gang leader in a neighborhood that is called Simon Pelé in the capital that was celebrating his birthday. And usually when this happens in these parties, the gang leaders distribute money or gifts to people, and mostly to kids. And in that day, the authorities knew that this gang leader was celebrating his birthday, and that he was going to be somehow exposed because he was going to be in a public place. And they used several drone strikes to try to kill him and other gang leaders that were present in the party. But in this effort to try to have at least a gang leader killed, they made a huge mistake, because they killed over 10 civilians, and most of them children that were aged between 4 and 12 years old.
And now there's a new force that was mandated, the Gang Suppression Force, which is also known as the GSF. It's supposed to be 5,500 troops. It was approved by the UN in September 2025. Diego, can you walk us through what is the Gang Suppression Force? What can it do realistically, and what are its limits?
When the government of Haiti asked for the deployment of a new foreign force in 2022, there was resistance both in Haiti and abroad because of past foreign interventions to authorize a new UN peacekeeping mission. So the UN Security Council authorized, what it authorized in 2023 was the deployment of a non-UN multinational security mission, because what people at the UN were saying is that in Haiti there was no peace to keep, and what it was needed was a strong force to make peace enforcement, to try to go and help the Haitian authorities to combat the gangs on the ground. So there was this adoption of a multinational security mission that was led by Kenya, but it faced huge economic shortfalls that made it only able to deploy less than 40% of all it expected personnel. So it had only less than 1,000 officers to try to combat the gangs that were rapidly expanding in the capital and in other departments. So essentially, it was only being able, because of the lack of funds, to act as a quick reaction force and to help slow down the gangs' advance. So, to try to overcome the shortcomings of the previous mission, the US and Panama proposed a new kind of framework that would allow the mission to have more reliable funding and improved logistics. This new mission also has a different nature, because the previous one was a police-led mission that was only on the ground to support the Haitian police. This new force has a much more robust mandate. It will be a military operation that will be able to conduct joint operations with the Haitian security forces, but also independent operations. And it will have more reliable funding, because there will be a UN logistical support office that will be funded through the UN peacekeeping budget. So most of the funds will come from these reliable fundings from the UN, and only the salaries of the people on the ground, of the mission personnel, are to be covered by voluntary contributions.
And Stuart, what does classifying Haiti as a non-international armed conflict mean for the operations of the Gang Suppression Force?
Well, they potentially will be able to use rules of engagement that comply with international humanitarian law and not just with law enforcement rules. That means that they might be able to use far more force than would otherwise be lawful under the prevailing rules. That said, for example, if we take the drone strikes, the fact that there is a non-international armed conflict does not mean that the state or this force could use those drone strikes wherever they wanted, even if they were targeting members of gangs who were engaged in serious criminality. The rules that govern the use of force in an armed conflict are limited to areas of hostilities. And the fact that we've called an armed conflict, in particular in Port-au-Prince, does not mean that the authorities, and even more so the peacekeeping force, or the Gang Suppression Force, would be able to use those drone strikes in other areas of the country. there are two different aspects of international humanitarian law. One governs the fighting, the other governs the protection of persons that are being detained. Those rules on detention apply everywhere, but the rules on the fighting are far more limited.
And a bigger question, what has changed in the international community's responsibility now that this is classified as an armed conflict?
Well, if you talk about states that are interested in the situation of Haiti, they have obligations to prosecute war crimes. And if people from Haiti that have been engaged in war crimes, then many states are not only willing, but they are also able, because of the legislation they've introduced, to prosecute those individuals. You can prosecute war crimes that are committed anywhere in the world. And that is a very different scenario to violations just of domestic Haitian law.
Thank you, Stuart. And my last question is for Diego. And I know this is complex, but Haiti has had multiple international interventions over the past 2 decades. All have failed, you could say. Your report is called Undoing Haiti's Deadly Gang Alliance. What actually needs to be different this time to undo this deadly gang alliance? Beyond military force, what's needed to actually make this work? And in your opinion, what would success look like?
Well, first, you need to show to the gangs that they are not the ones who are in control of the situation. So this new gang suppression force might be able, with their additional personnel, to allow the security forces that have been improving the coordination and have been mounting successful operations on the ground to not only be able to penetrate the territories that are controlled by the gangs, but also to have a permanent presence, to hold the territories that they are trying to recapture from the criminal control. What we explain in the report is that previous military campaigns have shown that, of course, having an armed superiority against the gangs would be a major breakthrough in Haiti. But if it is not done to completely dismantle these structures, it will be very difficult to extricate completely these gangs that are deeply entrenched in the communities that they control, that have been the de facto authorities in these territories for years, and also who still have very deep ties with powerful people from the elites. So, to minimize the bloodshed, to be able to deal and to sever the ties between the corrupt elites and the gangs, and also to re-establish state authorities in the territories that are now controlled by the gangs, we think that at some point the Haitian authorities should use dialogue to lower violence and to start a demobilization process to completely dismantle these structures and to end the cycles of violence that have lasted in Haiti for years, and most importantly, to sever the links between violence and politics in the country.
This has been the War Watch podcast, a series from the Geneva Academy exploring armed conflicts and the laws that seek to limit their impact. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss the next one. All the reports and resources we mentioned today are in the show notes. You can find the full legal analysis and documented violations on the War Watch portal at warwatch.ch. Haiti is one of the conflicts that we're tracking. Diego's full report, Undoing Haiti's Deadly Gang Alliance, is available at crisisgroup.org. I'm Juliette Graf. With me today was Stuart Casey-Maslen, head of the Geneva Academy's War Watch project, and our guest was Diego Da Rin, Haiti specialist with International Crisis Group. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to War Watch, a podcast from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, a joint centre of the University of Geneva and the Geneva Graduate Institute. Find us at geneva-academy.ch and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.